Welcome along to Obsession Engineering. Today I'm going to be rebuilding a pair of shocks from the 80s. These are Marzocchi or Marzocchi or whatever you want to pronounce them, Strada shocks. And I need these for a project bike rebuilt. So we're going to take them apart and see how to service them. To enable me to service these shocks correctly, I have downloaded the workshop manual, which is going to make life considerably easier, and I've also ordered a seal kit. So this has all the bits I should need to service the shocks, and I will put a link in the description from where to get these bits from. So these are a little bit older than the suspension I normally work on, but they're to go with a project bike I have downstairs, so they need servicing. This one we can see is leaking quite a bit of oil, and they were fitted in the 80s, so they're clearly not going to be working at their best anymore. So what we need to do is take them apart, replace some seals, get some new oil in them, and hopefully get them working like new. For complete transparency on this, I've never done a set of shocks this old before, and they are a little bit different inside to the stuff I'm used to. So this one I've actually already rebuilt so that I have some idea what I'm doing. So I'm just going to show you how to do the other one. Clean, resealed, serviced one out the way. Let's take this one apart, and the thing we have to do first is take the spring off, and it's the only bit really that if you were doing this at home would be a little bit awkward if you don't have a spring compressor. Spring compressor that I made myself many years ago is basically a plate with a hole in it at the top that gets held in place with some bolts, a hydraulic jack, and it basically squeezes the shock up so that we can get the collar at the end off the shock. So I now have my spring off, and the reason I didn't show you it in the spring compressor is because actually I had to slightly mod the compressor to make this shock fit, because it's a bit smaller than I'd normally use, a bit smaller spring than I'm used to. And so what we really need to do is get that collar off the end of the shock, because it sits on there. So we need to compress the spring enough to get that loose, and then push the bump stop out of the way. But I didn't want to show you the not particularly safe way of doing it. But I will admit, getting the spring off is probably the most awkward part of this whole operation. So with the spring removed, I've also taken off the preload adjuster that just literally slides down the body, and I have given it a bit of a clean in the degrease tank so that we don't take the dirt from the outside and end up with it on the inside. The next thing to do is make sure there's no pressure left in the shock. So there is a tiny little sort of air reservoir in these. So we'll open this up. It's just a Schrader valve in here. And we'll get a little pressure gauge and see if there's actually any pressure left in it. And that is a useful thing to know. Wind my pressure gauge on, open it up, and you can see there's a bit less than half a bar of air pressure inside there. But that's not bad, being these shocks are probably 40 years old. The fact there's still some pressure in there tells me that the bladder in here is still functioning. And that's very useful, because the seal kit I've got didn't come with a new bladder. So if that was no good, we'd have been in trouble. But luckily it's okay, so we can carry on and actually take the shock apart. But we'll let the air pressure out first. The next step is to make sure there's no oil pressure left in it, which would be unlikely, being as there's not a lot of air pressure, and there's a little like bleed screw here on the body, which is going to be pretty tight, because again, it's not been out in a very long time, so we'll just take that out quite slowly. But I can't imagine there's going to be a lot of pressure behind that, and there isn't. So I'm just going to take that out and let the horrible dirty old oil dribble onto my workbench. Now what I need to do next is undo the big nut at the bottom of the shock body that actually holds all the piston and shaft in, which involves a big spanner. And if it's anything like the first shock, a bit of grunting, because that is relatively tight and has been in there, again, for 40 years. Right, snug, but not terrible. So we'll wind that out. And even though we've been in the degrease tank, there's still a little bit of dirt around there, so just being careful that we don't drop anything into the shock body. We are going to give it a clean out, but it's easier if it's not got anything in it to begin with. So that's at the top of the thread, wind that up. And now we need to get out the gubbins that's in here. So basically, big nut that holds everything together, and then under here is basically your seal head. So there is an O-ring down in this groove down the side, and there is also your main oil seal in the middle. To loosen off the O-ring so that the seal head can actually come out, Marzocchi say give it a wiggle forward and backwards. like that, and basically that loosens the O-ring, and that'll allow it to then wobble enough that we can just pull it out the top. And with that suitably loosened off by wiggling forwards and backwards, we can nice and slowly just pop this out of here, and it's got a tube inside it. So we need to get all of that out, and then the other end of the tube, and stuck in the tubes in these, is the other end of the damper rod, or the other end of the damping mechanism. So if I slide this apart, pouring most of the oil down the sink, you can see we have seal head and piston, and then we have basically a tube and a separate damper, which I'm sure will come out there in a minute. Now that I've got the shock body separated to all the gubbins that go inside it, it's time to pour the oil away in there, give it a good swill out with some brake cleaner or a similar cleaning fluid. The manual actually says petrol or methylated spirits, but I haven't got any methylated spirits anymore. So, pour my rancid old oil away and give it a very, very thorough washing out. Inside the shock, the sort of damper in the piston actually runs inside it in a tube, and right at the bottom of the tube is a little hole. Now this, which is our compression sort of damping arrangement, that sits naturally in the end with the hole in it, so it's useful to always know which way around stuff like that goes. So the compression valve bit, I'm just going to give it a bit of a check, make sure that all the shims actually move and nothing sort of stuck in place or anything, but I'm not going to take it apart because we don't need to. I'm just going to give it a thorough clean, put it to the side. I will admit I was wrong there. The valving that sits at the end of this rod, end of this tube, that's actually the rebound stack. So now I've put it all back together, we'll put it out of the way and forget that I got that wrong. The next thing to do is take apart the compression piston and the seal head and the top out spring. It's not mega tight because it's not a particularly big thread. I'm going to lay everything out in place. So, nut, and then this sort of piston body, which is surprisingly tight on its shaft, but it will move. We're just going to slide that and all its valving arrangement off and lay it out on some rag. So this is the piston and damping assembly laid out, and it's pretty simple. Nut to hold it all together. This is the piston that goes up and down inside our inner tube, and you can see there's some holes in the middle and sort of piston ring and O-ring on the outside, and then we have a couple of little shims, a sort of shim plate that they sit on, and then a spring shim. So this is basically just a bent shim, and as the oil pushes through the holes in here, it's basically just going to push these shims out the way on the spring pressure from here. That's just a sort of a holder that holds it all together. That's a very basic little top out spring, a seal head with a seal on the inside of the outside. That's the big nut with the dust seal in it, and that's the bump stop. It's pretty simple as far as rear shocks go. To put it in comparison to something modern, this is the shim stack out of an SP1 Honda. So we've got a massive piston in comparison, and again this is actually quite small for a modern bike at 40mm, and then you can see we've got this big stock of shims on both sides on compression and rebound, and they create the damping. So there's a lot going on with a modern piston compared to what's going on here, which is why old shock absorbers aren't as good as new ones. In my seal kit there is a new bump stop, so that one can go out of the way. There is a new dust seal for inside the nut, so push the dust seal out, that can go out of the way, and then we need to take the O-ring off the outside of here and flick the dust seal, the oil seal, sorry, out the inside, replace the dust seal in the O-ring, clean all this stuff, and then we can basically put it all back together on the shaft. So here we go for reassembly. The bump stop, nut and seal head are back in there with the new seals on it, and then we have the top out spring, and then we have sort of the bottom of the piston, the little wave washer, and then the washer with 3 little cutouts in it, and the 2 shims. So that all slides down there, and there is a sort of a collar for it to sit on the actual shock. And then with my other hand we'll get the piston back, that slides down there, that traps all the shims in place, and obviously you can see the oil will go through the holes and push the shims out the way. So all I need to do now is put my nut back on, nip everything up, and we're ready to reassemble. with the piston and seal head and everything reassembled, it's time to put some oil in the body. So I've got it inclined so that the bleed hole on this side is at the top, or at the top of this section anyway, and we'll get some top quality K-Tech shock oil and pour it in the hole. So we'll give the oil a moment to run through the body and into the actual reservoir area, and then we'll just top that up until we start getting some oil coming out the hole. And there we go, we're getting oil out the hole now, so it's time to put on our new screw with our new O-ring from our new seal kit. We'll nip that up and then get the body upright. With the shock upright, I've then topped up to within about 2 centimetres of the top of the body. I've filled up with oil, and then I've gently pushed the damper rod in. Now this obviously has to sit into the inner tube, and it's quite snug. The new O-ring, the new piston ring's quite snug inside the ring, and so you have to just sort of wiggle it in a little bit by little bit and get it started. And what I've learned is if you push it a bit too hard, it fires in too much, fires all the oil out, and basically covers you in oil if you're not careful. So you have to be a little bit careful just wiggling this into the damping rod, into the damping tube, and then when that's in, and just in far enough so that the top out spring is covered in oil, you push the seal head down, and as you push this into the oil, obviously it pushes an excess of oil away. You have to have enough oil so that it pushes a bit out, otherwise you've not got enough in. And then, with the aid of a little screwdriver or pick or something, you have to go around the outside and poke your O-ring down. Basically, the O-ring has a starting position on the seal head, and then it has an actual sealing position, so you have to actually poke it down by hand to get it to sit. Once that's in place, you can make sure there's no excess oil in there. If there is, just drain it away, and then get your nut, wind that down and nip it up. I was recording this live as I was doing it, and for some reason it didn't record, so that's why I'm explaining it afterwards. With the nut done up so the damper is now all sealed up, you should get a reasonable amount of damping. So push it down. There's not masses of compression damping in these, but there's quite a lot of rebound. A lot of the logic back in the 80s, the same time they were doing damper rod forks a lot, was that the spring would be controlling your compression, so the damper shouldn't have to, which is why the rebound damping is quite a lot more excessive than the compression damping. But we have got good damping all the way through the stroke, so what we need to do now is put some gas pressure back in here. You can just put air in it, that's apparently absolutely fine, but being as I have a nitrogen supply with a nice accurate gauge on it, I'm going to put nitrogen in. With my gauge set up, I can open my gas supply, and we've got just over 2 bar. The sticker on the bottom of the shock says 28 psi, but the instructional manual says 28 to 46, so 2 bars absolutely fine. So 2 bar of pressure in there, lock the pressure in my reservoir, lock my gas cylinder off again, and that's it. We are gassed up. And I have to be honest, it doesn't feel like it makes a lot of difference having the gas in there. But this was the 80s, and generally back then there was no bladder. It was just some oil and some air, and it all tended to mix together, and then you ended up with not a lot of damping, which is why these were better, because they separated it. And the piston goes down, so the bladder must be working. Because if there was no bladder in there and everything was just full of oil, when you push the shock down, it would just go solid, because it would have nowhere to displace the oil to. So it is working, just compared to something modern, it doesn't really feel like it. With my new dust cover over my Schrader valve and the spring just on there with the preloading bits, I just need to compress the spring and get my collar back on. And that is it. I now have a rebuilt set of Strada shocks. I mean, I still don't know whether it's Marzocchi or Marzocchi, but I don't think that really matters. So thank you for watching, and join me again next time for some more motorbike fun.